I tell you what, I am so thankful to be a part of a church where we've got young people, as young as these up here singing, all the way up to the young at heart, but not so much in body group as well. And they did a great job. As I said in the last service, if I was trying to do the hand motions and sing simultaneously, you would have seen the preacher fall off the platform because I'm not coordinated like those young people. But they did an absolutely fabulous job with our regular choir, and I just thank the Lord for that. This morning, as you have seen with the video, that we are entering into a new series, and it's entitled Life Discipleship. Jesus' method is our model. And in this series, what we're trying to do is show you, actually, we are making some additions to our small group ministry, and we want to show you why we are doing this. There's an intentionality to it, so that our discipleship model here is through groups, and that we are achieving all that we see achieved in Scripture in the early church's discipleship model that was taking place. Now, when it comes to just life in general, there are routines everywhere. We all have different routines. For instance, most of you all probably have a morning routine. I'm just curious. Do you have a morning? I sort of have a morning routine I go through. Most of you do. Some of you, it's like wake up in the morning, you got to get your giddy up and go juice right off the bat, right? So you get your coffee, you sit down, you may read some of the Bible, maybe read some emails or whatever the case may be. Then you go and you shower and you put your clothes on, you brush your teeth, and off you go to your day's events. Everybody's morning routine's different, but most of us have a morning routine. When we get to work, often there's a routine. Most of you go through the same door that you always go through. You say hi to the same people. You walk into your office maybe. You turn on the computer. You answer emails, and then you start your day's projects. I don't know. Your work routine is probably different. The young people have their routines. They're waiting at the bus stop to get picked up by the school bus, or they're driving themselves if they're older, or the parents are driving them, drop them off. They go to their lockers, they get their books as they start their routine of their class schedule. Sports teams have routines. They start off with, warm up, get their muscles warmed up. Then they go to skill drills to really focus in on those individual skills. Then they move to maybe working through the play sets that their particular team has. And then most teams I was ever a part of, at the end of practice, we would scrimmage one another. That may be the routine that sports group is going through. But we see routines everywhere. Now, the question is, who came up with these routines? Did you, or are you following your parents' routines, maybe their morning routines, their bedtime routines, different things like that? Or were there others that you don't even know who set up these routines? Churches are a lot like that. Do you all realize we've got routines in churches? You take, for instance, Sunday morning. Your routine probably, if you're here, is to go to the 9:30 small group hour. And then you roll into the sanctuary here for the 11 o'clock worship time. But our routine when we come into here is that we usually have prayer and we have music. We have preaching. We have an invitation. Sometimes there's testimony. Sometimes there's drama. Sometimes there's, like the special mashup service music at the very beginning. But we follow these typical routines because routines help us as human beings to sort of move from one stage to the next stage to the next stage. Now, how about a discipleship routine? Do you recognize that in our small group discipleship that there are routines? Well, this year, Pastor Darren, our discipleship pastor, has been seeking to add some new routines to our small group ministry. And those new routines are needing some new leaders in addition to the teachers. And this series is to help you as a church to understand why we are changing up a little bit. We're not stopping anything we're doing. We're simply, with intentionality, starting a few more things, because what we see in the Bible is that there were discipleship routines that the early church followed, and we want to make sure with intentionality we're following very similar discipleship routines. And that's the goal of this series. Now, what I want us to see this morning is a very familiar passage in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. In this passage that's very well known, there are 4 routines, 4 practices of discipleship that the early church followed. Now, every week we're going to think through, now which routine are we covering in this week's message? But for this being the first message in this series, I want to go over all four routines or practices of discipleship in the early church. So let me read verses 42 through 47. It says, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers. Then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. Now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all as anyone had need. So, continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved." Now, if you've gone to church much at all, you've heard a preacher or a Sunday school teacher teach this text. Probably one of the more famous texts in all the Bible for churches today. But embedded in the text, maybe you've identified this, maybe you haven't. I think there's four routines or four disciplines that every disciple needs in their life in order to grow into that fully developed disciple. And we want this happening in our small groups. What are these four routines? Number one, every disciple should be learning. And we're using the life acrostic to help us remember this, because I'm not all that smart, so I need to have something to remind me. The L in life stands for learning. Notice in verse 42, it says, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine." Now, the word doctrine simply means teaching. So in the early church, what happened was that the apostles, who were the ones that Jesus trained, they were teaching the early church what they needed to know. Now, from whom did the apostles get their teachings that they then taught the early church? From whom did the apostles get their teachings? Jesus himself, exactly. So really, the apostles' doctrine are Jesus' doctrines. They're his teachings. And the apostles knew that it was imperative that they teach what Jesus taught them. Now, they did it in two different environments. Number one, they taught in a large group environment. Notice in the first part of verse 46, it says, "So continuing daily with one accord in the temple." Now, we know later in the book of Acts that's at Solomon's colonnade, and every day the Christians would meet there, and the apostles would teach them in that large group context, and even the people who were not disciples of Christ could hear what the apostles were teaching. That's the large group context. But in that same verse, we also see that they were fellowshipping in various things, but also the teaching took place from house to house. Now, that's what we would call the small group environment. And the apostles' doctrine were taught there. We see, even like the apostle Paul later, he was teaching in people's homes what they needed to know to grow as disciples of Christ. So the first discipline, routine of discipleship is learning. There needs to be teachers who are teaching Jesus' teachings to the people who are a part of the large groups and the small groups. Now, the second discipline is interceding. That's the I in life. So I stands for intercession. Now, what is intercession? It's a fancy word that simply means to help other people. So we see that the early church created environments where they were helping each other. Now, they helped each other on two levels. One was spiritual, one was physical. Notice in verse 42, the last part, it says, "and in prayers." This is the church helping the church on a spiritual plane. They are praying for one another as they learn the needs of each other. Now, I can tell you, in a group this large, just like the Jerusalem church was way too large to really know all the needs of individuals, the place you're going to find out needs of one another is in the small group. And in the small groups, you are praying for one another. You are interceding before God for spiritual things. But it's not just the spiritual. Notice in verse 44 and 45 of this text, it says, "Now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all as anyone had need." They were helping also on physical levels. When other Christians had physical needs, the ones who had stuff were extending their stuff to the people who have needs, and that's physical intercession. And it's in the small group environment of this church where you're going to find out spiritual needs and physical needs that you can pray for, and that you may even have the resources needed to help on the physical level. It's in the small group environment. So that's learning in a small group environment. That's interceding in a small group environment. Number 3 is fellowshipping, the F in life. And we notice in the third part of verse 42, it mentions fellowship. How? By the breaking of bread. Now, y'all know what that means, right? That means eating. And that shows you the early church were Baptists, obviously, right? Because Baptists love to eat. And that's what they did. They were eating together. But notice it says in verse 46, continuing daily in one accord in the temple. Notice it says daily they were gathering in the temple. That would blow somebody's schedule all to pieces, right? But they were meeting daily in one accord in the temple, and then breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. They were fellowshipping together in a small group environment, house to house. Now that's what we would call small groups. What's another name that we use in our church for our small groups? Life groups is what we're calling them. There's another old-fashioned name. Oh, Sunday school. You know what? I don't care what term you use. You knock yourself out if you want to call it Sunday school, you call it small group, you call it life group. What I want is you there. Okay? And I want you there learning, and I want you there interceding for each other, and I want you there fellowshipping. You know what? Jesus had fun with his disciples. And we need to have fun with one another where we become like family and friends. And that's a part of small group. And I don't know, I don't see you all laughing and things while I'm preaching and stuff. I don't see you fellowshipping with one another, because that's not what a large group is conducive for. You got to be in small groups to fellowship with each other. And this is nothing new. 2,000 years ago, the early church was doing the same thing. And then when you're learning and you're interceding with one another and you're fellowshipping together, then what happens is the community at large starts taking notice, and that's when you got opportunity to engage them with the gospel. That's the fourth activity or routine. E stands for engagement. And notice in verse 47, the people were praising God, and because they were praising God publicly, they were loving on each other privately. The neighbors were seeing all of this. The people in the temple were seeing all of this. The early Christians started finding favor with the community around them. And the community around them, neighbors, people in the courts of the temple, they began to talk to these early Christians. The early Christians could tell them about Jesus, and guess what eventually started happening? Then people started getting saved, and that's verse 47. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. These are the 4 routines, disciplines of discipleship. Learning and interceding with Christians to Christians, fellowshipping together, getting to know each other, love one another, and then together going out and engaging the community around us, whether it's our neighbors or whether it's even strangers in the public places. These are the 4 activities of discipleship. And to help us remember this as a church, what Pastor Darren and the leaders of our current small groups are doing is the teachers are still continuing to teach. But they have selected 3 other leaders in our life groups that can focus on the interceding, the fellowshipping, and the engaging, so that every life group, small group, Sunday school class, whatever you call it, so that they are intentionally focusing on these 4 disciplines that go all the way back to the early church. But where did the disciples get this model? Where did the disciples learn that to grow disciples, you got to learn, intercede, fellowship, and engage? Where'd they get it? Folks, they got it from Jesus. And that's what this series is all about. We're looking at Jesus and his apostles and how they taught others to follow this model that we're calling life discipleship. And our goal is that if you're a part of the leadership of a small group, you understand even better why you're doing what you're doing. If you're a member of a small group but not a part of the leadership, you understand why your leaders in that small group are doing what they're doing to help you do what you ought to be doing. And probably as important as anything If you're not a part of a small group, I want you to understand, I love having you in this room. Every week, I love getting to preach to you all. But I cannot disciple you in these 4 areas by myself. Jesus never discipled everybody by himself. So why would I think I could? Jesus set up small groups for discipleship. And that's where every one of us need to be, is in our church's small group discipleship. All right? So today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the first discipline, the first routine of discipleship. Which one is the first one? Remember, life, L-I-F-E. Which one is the first activity? Learning. You're all getting it. You're all smart people. You learn well. All right. So learning. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to Mark chapter 3, and we're going to see how Jesus set up his first small group. We're going to see what the extent of this small group was, and we're going to see how he led his small group in the area of learning. All right? That's what we're going to look at first. So the first point in Mark chapter 3 is that Jesus invited people into his small group. And that's pretty much the way your small group's going to grow, is if you as a teacher, leader, or member, you start inviting people into your small group. You see people around here you don't know, go up to them and say, hey, you a part of a small group? No, we're really not. I got a good one for you to go to. See, that's how Jesus did it. Is it now a good pattern for you to follow? Jesus invited people into his small group. Notice in verse 13 through 19. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and he called to him those he himself wanted, and they came to him. And then Jesus appointed 12, and that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach, and to have power to heal sicknesses and to cast out demons. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom Jesus gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed Jesus. And they went into a house. Now, this is not rocket scientists. This is not rocket science. This is Jesus simply deciding, I got a lot of people following me, but I'm going to set up a small group so I can teach and equip them to a deeper level. Now, the first thing about small groups, learning it from Jesus himself, is that small groups are to be limited, all right? Small groups are limited. Notice in verse 13 again, he says, Jesus called to him, to Jesus, those he himself wanted, and they came to him. Now, does that mean that Jesus only called 12 to him up on the mountain? Or is that more than 12? And if you go to Luke, we gain a little clarity from Luke's account of this, that actually this is more than a 12. Now, we don't know how many. We do know at one time Jesus sends out 70 in pairs, so it could be 70. We know that after his resurrection that he showed himself to 500 who had gathered together, so maybe he brought up 500. We don't know how many it is. The one thing we do know from Luke in particular, it's more than 12. Now, when this group comes up to Jesus on the mountain, then what does Jesus do? Look at verse 14. Then he appointed 12. So he had a larger group, out of whom he selected and invited a smaller group of 12. And that is the way that small groups work. Now, this 12 would be considered what we call a closed group. In other words, it was 12 and no more. For whatever reason that Jesus was training them, he was training them in a closed group environment. Now, the others who came up to him would be what we call an open group, that is always open to as many people who want to come and be a disciple following Jesus. Now, our Sunday school or our life groups that we have, like you all just came, many of you came from around this building, those are open groups. That means each Sunday you might get guests who come in and visit, and Jesus had that kind of small group environment. But you also at times may be a part of a closed group. For instance, let's take like on Thursday, there's a bunch of women's Bible studies that are taking place around here. I think once you go so far into that Bible study, that group closes because they are so far down the curriculum that someone coming in can't be caught up. So those are closed groups. And both of those exist in small group environments, and both of them have their place. Jesus had open group and he had a closed group. But notice, both of them were limited just to believers. And the closed group of the 12 is really getting small. Why? So he can really focus on discipling these 12. And you need to be a part of a small group, open or closed. You need to be a part of that. Now, the second thing I want you to notice about small groups, according to Jesus here, small groups are locational. Locational. Look at verse 14. It says, and that they might be with him and that he might send them. Now, you got two locations being mentioned in that phrase. One, that the 12, that he just set up his new small group, that the 12 might be where? With him. And that's what they did. Everywhere he went for about 3 years, there were the 12. And they were learning under Jesus' tutelage. And then, though, he gathered these 12 on a regular basis for a purpose. This is the part we got to be careful when it comes to our church small groups. Notice the second location. First, they were with him. Secondly, his intent was to send them. Send them where? Out. You see, in churches, often what happens is we create this small group, birds of a feather flocking together, as I said in the first service. Well, I don't know. We may have small groups that are all Alabama fans and others all Tennessee fans. None who are Kentucky fans with me. But what we do, if we're not careful, is we create these small groups. We really like each other, and we never want to go to a different small group. Well, once you get your few, and you never want to break out of that small group, then you've lost Jesus' purpose for small groups. The small group is that there is a period of time that you are with a teacher or a leader and that you are being equipped. Why? So that eventually you will go out and start another small group or be with a group that starts another small group. Jesus was multiplying the kingdom one person at a time, but also one group at a time. And that's how small groups were designed. They were to be limited in size, so there's intimacy and intensity of teaching, and they're to be locational for a period of time with the teacher and then a period of time sent out to multiply. And that was Jesus' model of small groups, and that's what we want to do. Life. You remember life, right? L stands for learning. I stands for intercession. Good, intercede. F stands for? Yeah, all right. And E stands for? Engage. Oh, man, you are smart. I didn't even test the first group that way. You all really knocked it out of the park. Now, here's the thing. Every one of those routines or activities has a leader in your small group if they have agreed with Pastor Darren and set this up. Your teacher is the learning leader, but there's also an intercessory leader that falls under our pastor emeritus, Mike Dawson. You got a fellowship leader that falls under our events pastor, Joey Scruggs, and you got an engagement leader that falls under our missions director, Blaine McFarland. And every one of these leaders throughout the course of this modeling is being encouraged, given ideas, to develop environments in each of the small groups in all 4 areas. And that's how our small group is. But remember, the goal is that the leaders in the small group are training up new leaders. Why? So we can start new small groups, and the idea is that every new small group has at least 4 people automatically in the small group. A learning leader, an intercession leader, a fellowship leader, and an engagement leader. That's how we want to multiply small groups. It's following the model of Jesus. Now, what do we do in the small groups? What Jesus did. That's the second thing. Jesus taught people in his small group. Let me read verses 20 through 23 and see how Jesus taught people. Verse 20 says, "Then the multitude came together again so that they could not so much as eat bread. But when Jesus' own people heard about this, then Jesus' own people went out to lay hold of Jesus, for they said, 'He's out of his mind.' And the scribes," verse 23, "and the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, 'He has Beelzebub, and by the ruler of the demons he cast out demons.' So Jesus called them, all of them, to himself, and he said to them in parables, 'How can Satan cast out Satan?' Now, I'm just stopping there because I want us to look at the process Jesus was following here. Now, in the previous verses, what had Jesus just done? He had just set up his small group, right? How many members were in his small group? 12 members in a small group. Now, next thing we see is Jesus interacting with all different kinds of people. Now, who do you think was close by watching Jesus interact with these 3 different kinds of people? His small group. His small group was watching the master teacher do ministry. And that's the first thing I want us to understand about how Jesus taught his small group. Small groups learn through life, through the life modeling of their teachers and leaders. And that's exactly what we see. Three different groups that Jesus was interacting with. Now that his 12 are following him, they went with him, right? So they're watching him interact with these three groups. What were the three groups? Number one, the multitude. Now we understand from the Bible that the multitude, you're talking thousands of people at the pinnacle of his ministry's popularity. Thousands of people were coming. And why were they coming to see Jesus? Two reasons we're told in the Bible. Number one, curiosity about the powerful preaching that he did. You see, the Jewish rabbis of that day, they didn't preach with authority from within their experience with God. They preached with an academic, rabbinic kind of authority. They would say things like, Rabbi so-and-so 200 years ago said this about this verse, and Rabbi so-and-so 150 years ago said this about this verse, and Rabbi so-and-so 25 years ago said this about this. And then how do you think the people reacted to that kind of communication and teaching? So when Jesus came on the scene, and he's like, I'm telling you, you've heard it said this, but I'm telling you this. And what became reported throughout Israel is this Jesus guy is preaching with power, unlike any of these rabbis that you've heard. And people out of curiosity wanted to hear what this Jesus guy had to say. But what else did Jesus do that drew even more people to him? Anybody? The miracles. Exactly. He was performing miracles that they had never seen done before. He was preaching powerful, and out of this curiosity, thousands were coming to him. They were coming out of curiosity. They were coming thinking, well, maybe I can get what I want out of this guy. And Jesus' brand new small group is watching Jesus interact with these multitudes who are coming for all of these various reasons. Now, do you think that the 12 apostles were learning how to deal with the multitudes by watching Jesus deal with the multitudes? You better bet they were. And Jesus wasn't even having to say a word to his disciples, and they're still learning. But it wasn't just the multitudes in verse 20. Look at verse 21. It was also his own people. Now, we're not talking about the Hebrew people here. You know who we're talking about here? A little further down in the chapter 3 and into chapter 4, you see, we're talking about Mama. Mama Mary, his mother, had heard, along with his half-brothers, because remember, Jesus was the firstborn of Mary. His father was the Heavenly Father through the overshadowing of the Holy Spirit is a virgin birth, right? But after Mary gave birth to Jesus, Mary and Joseph had some other boys and girls. So it's Mary and his half-brothers who were coming because they had heard Jesus is stirring up trouble with the religious leaders. And Mary's thinking, my son's about to get himself killed. And what does a mama do when the baby is being attacked? Mama's claws come out and she's coming to protect her baby. And that's in essence what we see in verse 21. Mary and Jesus' half-brothers are coming because they're thinking, Jesus, do you not realize that you're going to get yourself killed? And they're coming to rescue Jesus out. Now, the disciples are watching this the whole time. And they're seeing how Jesus interacts with his own mother and his own half-brothers. And when Jesus basically is declaring, saying, look, I am to fulfill my heavenly Father's will. And that he didn't say it this way, but he meant it this way. It trumps even my earthly mother's will for my life. And the disciples are watching Jesus interact with his biological family respectfully, but determined to obey God's will. Do you think the disciples learned something about life watching Jesus? How about the third one? Verse 22, the scribes. Notice these weren't any scribes. These guys came down from Jerusalem. These are the highfalutin scribes. And they're coming down, and notice the accusations they're slinging around at Jesus. Oh, you see these miracles, people? Let me tell you. God's not performing these miracles through this man. No. This man, Jesus, he is demon-possessed. He's not possessed by the little minor demons. He's possessed by the ruler kind of demons. And one of them, we know his name is Beelzebub. And this Jesus man, he's healing, he's exorcising, he's doing all of these things by demonic powers. And Jesus' brand new small group is watching these accusations. How's he going to deal with these? How's he going to deal with these? And they watch how Jesus dealt with even his own enemies. And I want you to notice, right after the small group is formed, we see that they began to learn probably more by watching Jesus live out his life in ministry than even really listening. And here's the thing about small groups in churches. Now let me have a little talk with our small group leaders. I don't care if you're a Bible study leader on Tuesday or if you're a small group Sunday school leader on Sunday or whatever. If you think that your job is complete when you finish teaching the lesson, you don't understand discipleship. Small group leaders teach their small groups more when their small groups see their small group leaders doing ministry. And that's what we're wanting our small groups to be. We want the leaders, intercessory leaders, creating environments where intercession is taking place. We want the fellowship leaders creating fellowship environments, the engaging leaders creating engagement environments, and we want the learning leaders, as much as they can, living out a life model of ministry in front of their students. Why do you want to do this? Because this is the way Jesus did it. And that's how discipleship. You know, when I first came here, I asked Pastor Rick if he would step up to be the executive pastor. The position he was in when I got here was the biblical education pastor. So he said yes and moved up. Then I asked Pastor Darren, who was the young adult pastor, would you step into Pastor Rick's position? But I would like for us to change the name of that position. Darren's like, well, what name do you want it? I'd like for it to be called the discipleship pastor. Here's my reason. Because a lot of churches call it the education minister or education pastor, but the problem is that education is only one of 4 activities of discipleship. Education is just the transference of information from one person to another. That's good. It is a part of discipleship, but it's not all there is to discipleship. Those transferring teachers also need to be emulating what they've been teaching by doing ministry in front of their groups. And that's what life discipleship is moving us toward. Because small groups learn probably more than anything by watching life modeling. But that's not all. The other way that Jesus taught was the way we traditionally think, through lessons themselves. Notice small groups learn also through lessons. Verse 23, so Jesus then called to himself and said to them in parables. You see, when you had the multitude, you had Jesus' relatives and you had the opponents, the scribes, and everybody's, trying to get something out of Jesus. Jesus finally said, all right, all y'all come here. I want to teach you something. And he publicly taught a lesson, and you notice I just quoted the very little bit of it. He was teaching it in parables. And how can Satan, cast out Satan? And he begins to teach a series of parables. This public teaching takes place all the way through Mark chapter 4, verse 9. But in verse 10 of Mark chapter 4, I want to read to you what it says. But when Jesus was alone with whom? Those around him with the 12. In other words, it's the open group of disciples and that closed group, and they were all together alone from what? Alone from the crowds. It says, but when Jesus was alone, those around him with the 12 asked Jesus about the parable. Notice it was only in the small group that the disciples, even in their confusion, had the opportunity to say, Jesus, what did you mean by these parables? And then down in verse 34 of this same chapter, it says, but without a parable, Jesus did not speak to them, the larger crowds. And when they, that's Jesus and his small group, were alone, then Jesus explained all things to his disciples. Have I ever said something from the pulpit that you're like, man, I'd like to ask him a question about that? We see that's what small groups are all about. I do know that our small groups, lots of time after the preaching, the 9:30 hour, they go in their small groups. And sometimes I know that have conversations about some of the topics that were discussed out in the sanctuary. That's how small groups work. I'm not opening it up for questions right now. You are always welcome to come and talk to me during the week or back in the foyer or whatever. I will be happy to talk to you about things. But small groups is the consistent, routine place that this kind of question and answer can go back and forth. It was the way Jesus did it. It's the way First Baptist does it. There should be learning in our small groups. But the learning is not just teaching verbally a lesson. The learning also is living out the lessons that you teach in front of your students. Because people learn from example probably even more than they learn from just a lecture. Jesus is the one who established small groups as a discipleship method. The early apostles established the church with small groups, house to house. And 2,000 years later, First Baptist Columbia has small groups. Now, we want with intentionality for our small groups not to just be transference of information from one brain to the next. We want it to be a discipling environment, and that's why we know our teachers are busy. They got lives they're living, jobs they're working, families they're taking care of. They probably can't do all of this. That's why we are adding to what has already been very successful, other leaders to help in these other areas. And all four types of leaders need to be training up new leaders so that out of those new leaders we can start even more small groups. So today I want you to, one of three things. One, you may already be a leader in a small group, or maybe you're just now starting. I want you to understand why we're doing what we're doing from a biblical point of view. And I want you to be praying, God, help me to disciple. Not just educate, but to disciple the way your son discipled. Number two, you may be a class member or a small group member, and you're like, why are we adding these extra leaders, and why are we doing more stuff? Well, I want you to understand, we're doing it because these are the four routines or the four practices or disciplines of discipleship. And that means you need to be involved as much as you can in all of them. But then number three, being a part of a disciple group doesn't save you. You remember who the 12th name was in Jesus' discipleship group? Judas. Being a member of a church 2,000 years later, and even a member in a small group or Sunday school class, doesn't save anybody. So the first group I want to make sure that everybody is a part of is the family of God. And that comes only by believing Jesus is God's Son. He died the death, paying the penalty for your sin individually. If you will ask Him to apply His death to your sin and give you His resurrected life that He has 3 days later. Then you become a part of the family of God, then you can become a part of a larger church family, and then you can become a part of a discipleship family. That's my prayer for you. Now, I, my wife, a couple of pastors, we're going to be right out here in the missions lobby. We'll have even a pastor up here if you want to come and talk to us about any of these three groupings. We want to make sure you're ready to be a true disciple of Christ.